A millionaire saves two homeless children begging in a street restaurant. When he takes them home, he immediately regrets it when he learns. The snow had settled into a thick, silent weight over the streets of New York. The air was sharp, biting against the exposed skin of anyone unfortunate enough to be outside. From inside his heated car, Oliver Stewart barely noticed the world beyond his tinted windows. Until he did. A small figure huddled beneath the awning of a luxurious restaurant, her arms wrapped tightly around something even smaller. A girl, no older than 8, clutched a toddler against her chest, shielding him from the wind as best she could. Her thin sweater was dusted with frost, her bare fingers pressed to the child's back in a desperate attempt to keep him warm. The boy, barely 2, was curled up against her like a kitten, his tiny face buried in her shoulder, his body limp with exhaustion. Oliver's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. The restaurant behind them gleamed with warmth, gold chandeliers casting a soft glow over well-dressed patrons dining on dishes that cost more than what this girl had probably seen in months. She didn't belong there, and clearly the staff had made sure she knew it. The light turned green. His driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, waiting for instruction, but Oliver said nothing. The car didn't move. Something about the scene clawed at him. It wasn't pity. He wasn't the type to be moved by sentiment. It was something else, something that made his stomach twist in a way he hadn't felt in years. Outside, the girl shifted, tucking her chin against the cold. She wasn't crying, wasn't begging. She simply held on. Oliver exhaled sharply. "Pull over." The driver hesitated only a second before easing the car to the curb. The moment Oliver stepped outside, the cold hit him like a slap. Raw, unforgiving. His polished shoes crunched against ice as he moved toward them. The girl tensed immediately, her grip on the toddler tightening. Her eyes, large and dark, flicked up to him, full of guarded suspicion. Up close, she looked even worse than he had imagined. Cheeks chapped red, hair stiff with ice, a ragged hole in the knee of her jeans exposing raw, frostbitten skin. The boy in her arms whimpered softly, his breath a faint puff of white in the freezing air. "Are you waiting for someone?" Oliver asked, his voice measured, careful. The girl didn't answer. Her posture remained rigid, her arms curling more protectively around the child. He glanced toward the restaurant. Through the glass, he could see the maître d' watching them with disinterest, as if the two children were nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a blemish on the otherwise pristine streets. Oliver's jaw tightened. He looked back at the girl. "Have you eaten?" Still nothing. She wasn't going to trust him. He didn't blame her. The toddler stirred slightly, letting out a soft, pitiful cry. "I don't want your money," the girl said suddenly, her voice hoarse, choked with cold. Oliver wasn't sure what surprised him more, the raw defiance in her tone or the quiet dignity beneath it. "I didn't offer any," he replied simply. The girl blinked, clearly taken aback. Her shoulders, stiff with tension, slumped just the slightest bit. The child in her arms whimpered again, and her focus immediately snapped back to him. She shifted her grip, rubbing his back, whispering something too soft for Oliver to hear. "Let me take you somewhere warm," he said. "Just for tonight." She hesitated, but he could see the war waging behind her tired eyes. She didn't want to trust him, but she was exhausted, and more than that, she was losing the battle against the cold. Her gaze flicked back toward the restaurant. There was a flash of something in her expression, not sadness, not even anger, just weary resignation. Oliver exhaled, then did something he had never done before. He crouched, bringing himself closer to her level. "You're not going to last out here," he said, his voice lower now, gentler. "Not in this storm." And his eyes dropped to the child, barely moving now. "He needs help." The girl swallowed hard. She knew it too. Slowly, painfully, she nodded. Oliver didn't wait for her to change her mind. He shrugged off his coat and draped it around her shoulders before leading them toward the car. The girl walked with wary, hesitant steps, but she didn't resist. As the door clicked shut behind them, sealing them inside the warmth of the vehicle, Oliver finally let out the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He had no idea what he had just gotten himself into. The city blurred past in streaks of amber and silver, headlights flashing against the frost-laced windows of the car. The warmth inside was overwhelming, pressing against Emma's frozen skin like an unfamiliar weight. She sat stiffly, curled around Andy as if she could still shield him, though there was no longer wind to fight against, no ice clawing at her cheeks. Her fingers, numb and aching, flexed slightly against the thick fabric of the coat wrapped around her shoulders. Oliver's coat. It smelled like something unfamiliar, like expensive cologne and leather, like a world she had never belonged to. She resisted the urge to pull it tighter. Andy stirred against her chest, his small breath warm against her collarbone. She reached up, smoothing his damp curls, and the movement sent her spiraling back to the cold, to the hunger, to the moment everything fell apart. The night she ran, the house reeked of whiskey. Stephen's voice had been low at first, just a mutter under his breath as he counted out bills at the kitchen table, his fingers trembling with rage. Then came the crash, a bottle smashing against the wall, shards of glass scattering across the peeling linoleum. Emma had frozen, breath caught in her throat as she clutched Andy closer. She already knew what was coming. "Useless little brat," Stephen had slurred, dragging a hand down his unshaven face. "Or to sell you. Make back some of what your mother cost me." The words had barely landed before Emma's pulse began to roar in her ears. She didn't wait. With Andy still pressed against her, she bolted, out the door, into the biting night air. Barefoot, pajama-clad, heart hammering against her ribs as she ran like the devil himself was clawing at her heels. There had been no plan, no place to go, only the knowledge that anywhere was safer than there. Emma's grip on Andy tightened as the memory faded. She'd learned quickly that the streets weren't much kinder than home. The first night, they had huddled beneath a stairwell, Emma wrapping Andy in her thin sweater, her own body curling around him against the wind. He had cried, small, pitiful sobs that cut through the silence of the alley. She had rocked him, whispering nonsense, promising warmth that didn't exist. Days passed in a haze of exhaustion. She scavenged what she could, stale bread from dumpsters, half-eaten sandwiches left abandoned on cafe tables. Once, she had stolen an apple from a fruit stand, her hands trembling so badly she almost dropped it. The shopkeeper had chased her down the street, yelling threats, but she had been too fast, too desperate. She had learned to move unseen. But no matter how careful she was, the hunger was constant, gnawing at her insides like a living thing. And Andy grew weaker by the day, his tiny body growing limp against her own. Then came the restaurant. The glow of the chandeliers had been blinding, a golden warmth that promised everything she could never have. She had hesitated at the door, shifting Andy in her arms. The smells alone had been enough to make her stomach cramp. Roasted meat, fresh bread, something rich and buttery. No one noticed her at first. She was just another shadow slipping through the edges of their world. But the moment she stepped further in, the change was immediate. A woman in a sleek dress pulled her purse closer. A waiter slowed his steps, brows knitting in irritation. Emma swallowed hard. She had no choice. Approaching the counter, she tried to keep her voice steady. "Excuse me." The man behind the register barely looked at her. "We don't do handouts." I don't need food," she stammered. "Just milk. My brother, he's only 2, and he hasn't—" The man's lip curled. "Not my problem." Emma's cheeks burned. She adjusted Andy in her arms, his small fingers gripping at her collar weakly. "Please. Just a little." A scoff, a shake of the head, then a sharp voice cut through the air. She's disturbing the guests." A woman, tall and cold-eyed, gestured for the nearest waiter. Before Emma could react, hands were on her shoulders, firm and unyielding. She barely managed to tighten her hold on Andy before she was shoved, physically pushed, toward the door. The world spun, the ground slick beneath her feet. And then she was outside again, the warmth vanishing in an instant, replaced by the sharp sting of the wind. The door shut behind her with a finality that left her breathless. She had stood there, stunned, Andy whimpering softly against her chest. For the first time, she had felt something deeper than hunger, something colder than the wind. Emma blinked, the present settling around her once more. The restaurant was gone. The cold was gone. But the ache in her chest remained. She glanced sideways. Oliver sat still, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, his expression unreadable. She didn't trust him. Didn't trust the warmth of the car, the coat on her shoulders, the promise of shelter. People like him, people who wore suits and lived in high-rise buildings, didn't care about people like her. She knew better than to believe in kindness. So she kept her grip on Andy tight. And she waited. Waited for the moment when this, too, would be taken away. The car finally stopped after several tense minutes in the car. Oliver glanced slightly at the little girl cowering in his car, making him think of himself as a child kidnapper, making him confused. The gates creaked open with a mechanical hum, revealing a long, winding driveway lined with neatly trimmed hedges, the branches dusted with snow. The car moved smoothly along the cobblestone path, its tires crunching softly against the frost-covered stones. Towering above them, barely visible through the falling snow, was a mansion, its windows glowing faintly against the cold, an elegant fortress of glass and steel. Emma gripped Andy closer. The warmth of the car had started to seep into her bones, thawing the deep chill she had carried for so long, but it wasn't comforting. It made her uneasy. She had spent so much time in the cold that warmth felt foreign, unnatural, like something she hadn't earned. Beside her, Oliver remained silent, his gaze fixed ahead, his expression unreadable. The car slowed to a stop, and before Emma could brace herself, the door swung open. A rush of crisp night air met her face, sharp, but no longer unbearable. A man in a neatly pressed uniform stood outside, his posture straight, his expression professional but distant. "Welcome home, sir." His eyes flickered toward Emma and Andy, lingering for a moment before returning to Oliver. Home. The word struck something deep inside her. Emma hesitated, her body instinctively recoiling. This wasn't her home. It never would be. Oliver, who had already stepped out, turned slightly. "Come on." His voice was steady, neither harsh nor particularly gentle. He wasn't asking. Emma's stomach twisted. A moment passed. Then, with reluctant movements, she slid out of the car, Andy still cradled against her chest. The warmth hit her first. Inside, the house was expansive, its ceilings high, the walls lined with paintings she couldn't name. Everything felt untouched, like no one really lived here. The floors gleamed under the soft light of chandeliers, and the air smelled of something clean, something expensive. She barely noticed the small group of house staff gathered near the entrance, their expressions carefully neutral, as if waiting for some kind of instruction. Oliver barely spared them a glance. "Make up a room," he said simply before striding further inside, loosening his tie as he walked. Emma didn't follow immediately. Her feet remained planted just past the threshold, her heart pounding in her ears. This place felt too big, too quiet, too much like somewhere she didn't belong. A woman, mid-40s, dressed in a simple but immaculate blouse, stepped forward, her expression softer than the others. "Come, dear, let's get you both warm." Emma's fingers clenched instinctively against Andy's back. She didn't move. The woman hesitated, then gestured gently. "I'll show you to the dining room. You must be hungry." Emma wasn't. Not really. Hunger had been a constant companion for so long that its absence felt strange. But Andy needed food, so she forced herself to step forward. The dining room was nothing like the restaurants she had been chased out of. The table stretched long, polished wood gleaming beneath the soft glow of the chandelier. A single place had been set near the end, and as she lowered herself into the chair, she had to fight the urge to bolt. A steaming bowl of soup was placed in front of her. The scent of warm broth curled into the air, rich and savory. Beside it, a fresh roll of bread, soft in a way she had almost forgotten food could be. Emma didn't touch it. She had learned not to trust food given too easily. Too many times, it came with conditions. She glanced up, but Oliver was nowhere in sight. Andy whimpered against her, weakly shifting, and Emma reached for the bottle of milk set near her plate. She held it to his lips, watching as he latched on desperately, his small hands grasping weakly at her sleeve. She swallowed hard. Andy was too weak to be cautious. She wasn't. Minutes passed. The warmth of the soup filled the space around her, teasing, tempting. Her stomach twisted painfully, but she still didn't move. Then, without thinking, she dipped the spoon into the broth. She took a small sip. The heat spread through her, unfamiliar and jarring, but she didn't stop. Another sip, then another, carefully, slowly. She didn't trust it, but her body did. Later, a warm bath was drawn for her, and Emma stood stiffly in the tiled bathroom, the steam curling against the air. The water was too hot at first, making her flinch, but she forced herself to step in. It had been too long since she had felt clean. Andy sat in her lap, his small body sinking into the warmth, his exhausted limbs going limp. He had stopped shivering. When they emerged, fresh clothes were waiting. A pair of soft pajamas and socks that didn't have holes. It felt like a dream, not a good one. One of those dreams where everything felt just a little too perfect, just a little too safe, right before the world came crashing down. That night, Emma lay in a bed too soft, the blankets too thick, the pillow swallowing her whole. Andy was tucked beside her, his breathing slow and steady. She stared at the ceiling. She had slept on concrete, on stairwells, in doorways where the wind howled through cracks, biting into her skin like teeth. This wasn't real. This was borrowed, and borrowed things were always taken back. So she didn't sleep. Not yet. She had to be ready. The clock on the far wall read 00:47 a.m. Oliver exhaled slowly, pinching the bridge of his nose as he leaned back in his chair. His study was dimly lit, the warm glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows against the walls lined with books and neatly stacked files. Outside the window, the snow continued to fall in a quiet, relentless drift, blanketing the city in a hush that felt strangely distant from the world inside this house. His laptop screen flickered with the latest reports, market projections, investment trends, emails waiting for a response. Work was endless, a cycle that never stopped spinning. He was used to it. He preferred it. But tonight, his mind wouldn't settle. His eyes drifted toward the closed door, toward the hallway beyond, where just hours ago, two small figures had entered his home. Two strangers, two children. They were asleep now, tucked into warm beds with full stomachs, unaware that the man who had brought them in was still sitting here, wondering what exactly he had done. Oliver had spent years building an empire, accumulating wealth that granted him everything except the one thing he no longer searched for: connection. Success had insulated him from the world, filling his days with contracts, meetings, and obligations that left no room for anything else. And yet, in a single night, that carefully maintained distance had been breached. He had saved them. But for the first time in years, Oliver wasn't sure if he had done it for them or for himself. The clock struck 1 a.m. And still, he did not move. The morning light crept through the heavy curtains, casting muted streaks of gold across the room. The world was still, silent except for the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the distance. Emma lay on her side, her back curled protectively around Andy, who slept deeply, his tiny breaths even and warm against her arm. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, the ceiling above her vanished, replaced by the open sky, the cold wind biting at her skin, the distant sound of footsteps that always meant danger. But now, the only sound was the quiet hum of central heating and the occasional rustle of blankets. Still, the unease didn't leave her. Her stomach clenched as she listened, waiting for something to break the illusion. A harsh voice, a demand, a reminder that none of this was really hers. A soft knock at the door made her flinch. She pushed herself up, instinctively shielding Andy. The door opened slightly, and a woman, perhaps the same one from last night, though Emma hadn't bothered to look too closely, offered a tentative smile. "Breakfast is ready, dear." Emma didn't answer. She watched the woman linger for a moment before retreating, leaving the door open just enough for Emma to see the hallway beyond. A house so large, so empty of sound, felt unnatural. Andy stirred beside her, rubbing his eyes sleepily. She exhaled. No choice now. The dining room was far too grand for just 3 people. Emma hesitated at the threshold, but Andy's whimper of hunger pushed her forward. She kept her eyes down as she slid into a chair, cradling Andy in her lap, her movements careful, wary. Oliver was already there. He sat at the head of the table, a cup of black coffee in his hand, reading something on his phone. He didn't look up immediately, but when he did, his gaze flickered over Emma and Andy, assessing. Emma stiffened. "Did you sleep?" he asked. She didn't answer. Oliver let out a slow breath, setting his phone down. A plate was placed in front of her, scrambled eggs, toast, a small dish of jam, the kind of breakfast that once would have seemed like a feast, but now made her stomach twist with something she couldn't name. Andy reached for the toast first, his small fingers barely able to grasp it properly. Emma adjusted him in her lap, steadying his hand as he took a bite. Oliver watched the scene unfold with unreadable eyes. After a long pause, he cleared his throat. "What's your name?" Emma froze. She kept her eyes on Andy, her grip tightening slightly. Oliver leaned back in his chair. "I brought you into my house. It only makes sense that I should at least know who I'm living with." Emma swallowed, her throat dry. She didn't want to answer. Giving someone your name meant letting them in. But he was waiting. She shifted uncomfortably. "Emma," she muttered, barely above a whisper. Oliver's head tilted slightly, as if considering the name. "Emma." He let it settle between them before nodding. "And him?" She hesitated. Then, softly, "Andy." Oliver took a sip of his coffee. "I'm Oliver." Emma glanced up, startled. He said it simply, like it wasn't important, like he wasn't someone who owned a house so big it felt like a hotel. The way he spoke his own name made it sound almost normal. It didn't fit the image she had of him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The only sound was Andy chewing softly, his fingers sticky with jam. Oliver sighed and reached for his phone again. "Eat," he said. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to, but you do have to eat." Emma hesitated, but the warmth of the food was impossible to ignore. She picked up a piece of toast, nibbling at the edge. It was safer than the soup had been. Less rich, less overwhelming. Just bread. Just something to keep her going. Oliver didn't say anything else. Maybe that was the first thing she didn't hate about him. The rest of the morning was a blur of silence. Oliver disappeared into his office, and Emma found herself alone in the vast, unfamiliar house. Andy had fallen asleep again, curled up in a blanket on the couch, his tiny body rising and falling with each slow breath. Emma hesitated near the staircase. She should stay put, stay where she was told. But the house was too quiet, and she had always been good at moving quietly. She wandered, room after room, each more untouched than the last. Polished furniture, walls lined with books, a piano that looked like it had never been played. Then, a room that felt different. She paused in the doorway, heart pounding for no reason she could explain. The study was dim, the heavy curtains drawn, but there was something lived in about it. Papers scattered across the desk, a single lamp casting a warm glow over dark wood. Emma took a step inside. There was a bookshelf near the window filled with thick, leather-bound books. She ran her fingers lightly across the spines, tracing the dust. Then she saw it, a framed photo. It was the only one in the room, sitting off to the side of the desk, almost hidden among the clutter. A younger Oliver, standing beside a man who shared his sharp features, both looking straight at the camera. She reached out, fingertips brushing the edge of the frame. "What are you doing?" Emma spun, her stomach flipping. Oliver stood in the doorway, arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, but his voice wasn't angry. Just cautious. Emma took a small step back. She shouldn't have come in. She had crossed a line. Oliver studied her for a long moment before exhaling, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "You don't have to sneak around," he said finally. "If you want to look at something, just ask." Emma didn't answer. She cast one last glance at the photo before quickly slipping past him, disappearing down the hall before he could say anything else. Oliver watched her go. She was still afraid of him, but maybe, just maybe, she was a little curious too. The snow outside fell in thick, lazy drifts, blurring the world beyond the window. The roads had become impassable, turning the city into a quiet, frozen landscape. Inside, the house was still. The usual morning routine, Oliver leaving for work, the subtle bustle of staff, had been replaced by an unusual silence. Oliver had chosen to work from home today. He sat at his desk, scanning through reports, occasionally rubbing his temple in frustration. He hadn't spoken much since breakfast. Emma preferred it that way. Across the room, she perched stiffly on the couch. Andy nestled against her. The little boy had been irritable all morning, fussing and whimpering, his small fingers tugging at Emma's sweater. She rocked him gently, whispering soft reassurances. But nothing seemed to work. Andy's cries grew louder, his tiny face scrunching up in distress. Oliver's fingers hovered over his keyboard. He could tune out the hum of a crowded boardroom and ignore the clamor of a negotiation gone south. But this small, helpless wailing made his focus slip. He stood up. Without a word, he crossed the room, grabbed the remote, and turned on the television. The sudden burst of sound startled Emma, her head snapping up in alarm. A colorful screen flickered to life, bright animations dancing across it, filling the space with cheerful music. Andy paused. His crying hiccuped into a confused sniffle as his gaze shifted toward the screen, his small body stilling. Emma stared. "You can keep it on," Oliver said, his voice low as he sat back down. She hesitated. "Won't it bother you?" Oliver shrugged, his attention returning to his laptop. "I'm fine." She blinked. She had met a lot of people in her life. Most of them were quick to shove her aside, to treat her like an inconvenience. But Oliver had just willingly allowed something disruptive into his carefully structured world. For them. She swallowed, looking back at the TV as Andy finally relaxed, his tiny fingers loosening their grip. Emma didn't say thank you. But she didn't turn the TV off either. That night, after dinner, Emma found herself wandering again. The house was too big, too quiet in some places, too overwhelming in others. She stuck close to the hallways she had already walked through before, her fingertips brushing along the wooden banisters, the smooth wallpaper cool under her touch. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Then she saw it. A library. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, tall shelves lined the walls, stretching high toward the ceiling. The scent of old paper and polished wood filled the space, And for the first time since she had arrived, Emma felt a pull towards something. She had always liked books. Peeking inside, she hesitated. Then, turning back toward the hallway, she caught sight of Oliver heading toward his study. She bit her lip before calling out, "Can I?" Oliver paused. His brow lifted slightly as he followed her gaze to the library. Then, instead of answering, he stepped past her, pushed the door open fully, and walked inside. "Come on," he said over his shoulder. Emma hesitated again before following. The shelves stretched impossibly high, the sheer number of books making her feel small in a way that wasn't entirely bad. Oliver walked past rows of neatly arranged spines, trailing his fingers lightly over the edges before stopping near a smaller section. He pulled out a book, glanced at the cover, then handed it to her. "This one's good," he said simply. Emma took it slowly. The cover was smooth beneath her fingertips, the weight of it solid and real. She looked up. Oliver was watching her, but his gaze wasn't expectant. "Just be patient." Emma shifted, her fingers tightening around the book. She wasn't used to people offering her things without expecting something in return. Then, just as she was about to step back, something else caught her eye. On the lowest shelf, tucked between thicker volumes, was a leather-bound album. It stood out, not just because of its worn cover, but because it didn't belong with the other books. It looked personal. Emma hesitated, then pointed. "What's that?" Oliver followed her gaze. For a second, he didn't move. Then he reached down, sliding the album from the shelf. His fingers brushed over the cover, his expression unreadable. "It's old," he said after a moment. "I haven't looked at it in a while." Emma glanced up at him. "Can I see?" He hesitated, just for a moment. Then, with a quiet sigh, he nodded. They sat together near the window, the dim glow of a nearby lamp casting soft light over the pages, as Oliver flipped the album open. The first few images were black and white snapshots of unfamiliar faces, people Emma didn't recognize. Then, as they turned the pages, the pictures became clearer. A younger Oliver, standing beside what must have been his parents, a graduation photo, a group picture with unfamiliar teenagers in uniforms. And then, Emma's breath caught. She froze, her fingers tightening on the edge of the page. A familiar face. A woman, young and smiling, standing beside a few others, her expression warm, her eyes bright. Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. "That's my mum." Oliver stiffened. His gaze snapped toward her, then back to the photograph. Emma's heart was pounding. "When you hear this story, is it day or night where you are? What about sharing it in the comments below?" She reached out, her fingers brushing against the image as if touching it would make it more real. "That's her," she repeated, louder this time. "That's my mum." Oliver's expression shifted, something unfamiliar flickering behind his eyes. His voice, when he spoke, was quieter than she expected. "What was her name?" Emma swallowed hard. "Deborah. Deborah Brown, before she married my dad." Silence settled between them. Oliver didn't move, didn't speak for several moments. When he finally looked at her, his face was unreadable. But his eyes held something different now. Something deeper. "Deborah Brown," he echoed, almost to himself. The realization hit him like a slow-moving storm. Emma watched as his fingers traced the photograph, as his jaw tensed just slightly. "You knew her," she whispered. Oliver exhaled, leaning back against the chair. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I did." Emma didn't know what to say. Neither did he. But in that moment, something shifted. And for the first time since she had arrived, Oliver no longer looked at her as just a child in need of shelter. He looked at her as the daughter of someone he once knew. And that changed everything. Oliver barely slept that night. Even after Emma had gone to bed, after the house had settled into silence, after the snow outside continued its steady descent, He remained in his study, staring at the faded photograph. Deborah Brown. It had been years, decades, since he had last thought about her. The girl who used to sit beside him in chemistry class, who always had an easy laugh, who believed in the good in people. The friend he had lost touch with the moment he left for college, too caught up in his ambitions to look back. And now, her daughter was sleeping under his roof. The weight of that realization pressed against his chest, unfamiliar and unshakable. His fingers hovered over his laptop's keyboard. He hesitated. Then, exhaling sharply, he began to type. The next morning, Oliver remained home. The roads were still buried in snow, and while his company could function without him for a day, he had other matters to focus on, like Deborah. He sat in his study, scrolling through records, piecing together the life of someone he once knew. What he found made his stomach twist. She had married young, moved out of the city. 2 kids. No stable income. Her husband, Stephen Burns, a name he instantly disliked, had been arrested multiple times for domestic disturbances and debts. And then 2 years ago, she was gone. Complications after childbirth. Oliver closed his eyes. Guilt curled deep in his ribs, sharp and unrelenting. He had been building empires while she had been struggling to survive. They used to have a common starting point. Could he have done something? Reached out? Would she have even let him? A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Emma stood at the threshold, her posture stiff, as if she had debated coming in. Oliver shut his laptop. "Come in." She hesitated before stepping inside, her gaze flickering toward his desk before landing on him. She wasn't the kind of child who fidgeted. She didn't kick at the floor or pick at her sleeves. She stood still, measured, as if expecting to be dismissed. Oliver exhaled, leaning back. "You want something?" Emma glanced toward the bookshelf, then back at him. "Can we talk about my mum?" They sat on opposite sides of the desk. Emma's fingers traced the edge of the leather-bound album as she spoke. Her voice was quieter than usual, hesitant, like she wasn't used to sharing anything that mattered. "She sang a lot," she said after a pause. "Not like fancy singing, just humming. Before bed, when she was cooking, she always said it made the house feel warmer." Oliver nodded, listening. She liked lilacs. Said they reminded her of when she was little. Emma hesitated. "Did you know that?" Oliver blinked. "Yeah," he admitted. "She used to say they smelled like summer." Emma's lips pressed together, and for the first time, she looked at him without suspicion. "She was kind," Emma continued. "Even when we didn't have anything, she always found a way to make things feel okay. She'd make up stories about castles and dragons when there wasn't enough food. She always made Andy laugh, even when he was really little." Oliver's throat tightened. He could picture Deborah so clearly now, the same warmth in Emma's words as he had once seen in her smile. And yet, he hadn't been there, hadn't known, hadn't helped. "I should have kept in touch," he said suddenly. Emma tilted her head. "I should have been there," Oliver clarified, his jaw tightening. "I had the means, the resources, and I didn't." Emma was silent for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she shrugged. She wouldn't have asked for help. Oliver looked at her. Emma met his gaze evenly. She never wanted to be a burden, even when things got really bad. Oliver exhaled. "That sounds like her." Emma nodded. Another pause. Then, softer. "She would have liked you helping Andy." It was the closest thing to acceptance Oliver had gotten from her, and for the first time since they had met, she didn't seem like she was waiting for him to fail. The house was quieter than usual that evening. The kind of quiet that felt unnatural, heavy, like the air was waiting for something to happen. Outside, the snow had piled higher against the windows, casting a dim white glow into the halls. The storm had worsened since morning, turning the city into a frozen landscape, isolating them further from the world beyond. The children had been here for a week. The snow was just an excuse. Oliver wanted to do something more for them than a night's lodging with some bread and milk. Oliver sat in his study, working, though his focus had drifted more than once. The numbers on his screen blurred together, the reports he usually processed within minutes now taking twice as long. He exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck, wondering if exhaustion was finally catching up to him. And then he heard it. A small, choked sound. His head snapped up. The cry came again, muffled but unmistakable. He pushed back from his desk, moving swiftly toward the hall. As he stepped into the dimly lit corridor, the sight before him made his stomach tighten. Emma stood just outside the guest bedroom, her arms wrapped tightly around Andy, her face pale, her eyes wide with barely contained panic. The little boy was trembling in her grasp, his face flushed with fever, his breathing shallow and uneven. His small fingers clutched weakly at her sweater, his body hot even from a distance. Oliver's heart kicked hard against his ribs. "He won't stop burning up," Emma whispered, her voice thick with fear. He didn't hesitate. "Give him to me," he said, stepping forward. Emma clutched Andy closer, her instinct to protect overriding her reason. But then she looked at Oliver, really looked at him, and saw something in his face that made her falter. Not frustration, not impatience. Something steady, something certain. With a slow, reluctant movement, she let him take Andy into his arms. The child's weight was nothing compared to the sheer heat radiating off him. Oliver could feel it through his shirt, a pulse of fever that sent alarm bells ringing in his mind. Without wasting another second, he turned sharply on his heel. "We need a doctor." Minutes blurred together after that. A call was made. Voices filled the house. The once quiet evening erupted into movement as a private doctor arrived, his assistant close behind. Oliver barely registered the exchange of words, the rushed instructions, and the cool press of a stethoscope against Andy's fragile chest. Emma stood frozen near the door, arms crossed tightly over herself, as if bracing against something unseen. She didn't speak, didn't move. Oliver, on the other hand, moved closer. The doctor's words were measured and professional, but the underlying warning beneath them was clear. "His fever is dangerously high. If he hadn't been brought in tonight, it could have gotten much worse." Emma flinched. Oliver barely resisted the urge to close his eyes, to exhale in frustration. Not at her, not at Andy, but at the weight of what could have happened. Instead, he simply nodded. "What do we do?" The doctor handed over a bottle of medicine. Listing instructions Oliver absorbed in sharp detail. Cool compresses, fluids, rest, monitoring. "I'll check in tomorrow morning," the doctor assured before leaving. And then finally, the house was quiet again. Oliver stayed. He had planned to leave once the crisis was over, to retreat back into his study, to finish the work that still needed his attention. But something kept him there. Something rooted him to the chair beside Andy's bed. The boy slept now, his fever still present but lower, his small chest rising and falling in steady breaths. His tiny fingers twitched against the blanket, his body shifting slightly in sleep. Emma hadn't moved from her place near the bed, her fingers clutching the edge of the comforter, as if letting go would mean losing him. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just sat there, the weight of the night pressing into her small frame. Oliver glanced at the clock. 2:14 a.m. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He should go, should leave her to rest. But somehow, walking away didn't feel right. Instead, he leaned back against the chair, crossing his arms as his gaze drifted back toward Andy. The boy looked so small, so fragile in the vastness of the bed. "Thank you." The words were soft, barely more than a whisper, but they stopped him cold. Oliver turned slightly, meeting Emma's gaze for the first time that night. She looked exhausted, shadows beneath her eyes, her shoulders tense from holding herself together for too long. But there was something different about her now, something less guarded, something that wasn't quite trust, but wasn't outright rejection either. He hadn't expected gratitude, but there it was, simple, honest. Oliver didn't respond right away. Instead, he gave a slow, measured nod, as if acknowledging a truth neither of them was quite ready to say out loud. And then, for the first time since they had arrived, Emma didn't look at him like she was waiting for the moment he would change his mind. She looked at him like, maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to believe he wouldn't. The snow had begun to melt, revealing the dark pavement beneath, though remnants of winter still clung stubbornly to the edges of the sidewalks. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp, biting cold that seeped into the morning air. Inside the mansion, however, the warmth remained steady, a quiet sanctuary against the outside world. Oliver had planned for a normal day, or at least as normal as life had become with 2 children now occupying space in his home. Andy was recovering, his fever finally under control, and Emma, while still wary, had softened, even if only slightly. It was a delicate balance, one Oliver was slowly growing accustomed to, but balance never lasted long. The knock at the door was sharp, insistent. Oliver, seated in his study, barely looked up at first. His mornings were filled with business meetings and negotiations, but something about the way the knock echoed through the halls felt off. A moment later, a voice, low, uneasy, carried through the house. "Sir, there's a man at the door. He says he's here for Emma." Oliver stilled. The words settled like ice in his stomach. He rose, his movements slow, deliberate, as he stepped into the hallway. And then he saw him. Stephen Burns. The man stood in the foyer, shoulders squared, his face marked by rough edges and deep lines, the kind carved from years of bitterness and self-inflicted destruction. His clothes were wrinkled, his coat frayed at the edges, the scent of stale alcohol barely masked by cheap cologne. His eyes, dark and calculating, flicked around the space with a mix of greed and self-importance, as if sizing up the wealth that surrounded him. But when his gaze landed on Oliver, his mouth twisted into a grin, mocking, predatory. "I hear you've got something of mine." Oliver's expression didn't change. His stance remained composed, unreadable. But something dangerous flickered beneath his otherwise calm exterior. Emma's father, the man who had left her and Andy to fend for themselves, who had chosen addiction and violence over responsibility. And now, he wanted her back. Footsteps sounded behind him. Oliver didn't need to turn to know Emma had appeared at the top of the staircase. He felt it in the air, the sudden shift, the way everything inside her went still. He heard her sharp inhale. He saw the way her small hands gripped the railing, knuckles white, and he knew. She was afraid. Stephen's smirk widened when he spotted her. "There she is," he drawled, his voice almost amused. "My little girl. I had a hard time finding you. The people at the restaurant up the street said a rich man had taken them. I thought you had been taken to work as a maid, but you seem to be doing well." "Who is it, Oliver Stewart?" he said, glancing at Oliver. Emma didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Oliver's voice was quiet, controlled. "You need to leave." Stephen let out a short, humorless laugh. "You can't keep a man from his own daughter." Oliver's jaw tightened. "She's not your daughter anymore." "Blood's blood," Stephen said, stepping forward, voice dripping with fake concern. "Come on now. Emma, sweetheart, let's not make a scene. It's time to go home." Emma flinched. It was small, barely perceptible, but Oliver saw it, and suddenly, something inside him snapped. He took a single step forward, his presence unshakable, and in an instant, the power dynamic in the room shifted. "I said, Oliver repeated, his voice low, deadly. Leave. Stephen's smirk faltered just slightly. Now listen here, Mr. Moneybags. You think you can just buy my kid? That's not how this works. Oliver's patience thinned. I didn't buy her. You threw her away. A flash of anger flickered across Stephen's face, his posture shifting. She's my responsibility. If you want to keep her, it's going to cost you. There it was. The truth beneath the act. He didn't come for Emma. He came for money. Oliver let out a slow breath. His next words were deliberate, razor-sharp. You think I can't see through you? He took another step forward, his presence towering, suffocating. You don't care about her. You never have. You see a billionaire and you see an opportunity. That's all this is to you. Stephen sneered. And what are you then? Some rich guy playing hero? You think you can keep her locked up in this fancy house forever? No, Oliver said, his voice cold as steel, but I can make sure she never has to see you again. Emma let out a shaky breath. Stephen's smirk wavered, but he masked it quickly, stepping back. I could go to the cops, you know. Tell them you took her. Oliver smiled, a slow, dangerous thing. Go ahead, he said smoothly. Tell them how you tried to sell your own daughter. Tell them how you abandoned her on the streets. Tell them how she was found starving, freezing, carrying a toddler she was never meant to care for alone. He tilted his head, as if considering. Let's see how well that works out for you. Stephen's face twisted in rage. You think you're untouchable? He spat. Oliver's expression didn't change. Number but you are. A beat of silence. Then the front doors opened again. This time 2 men in suits stepped inside, their movements professional, precise. Stephen stiffened. My lawyers have already started the paperwork, Oliver said smoothly. By the end of the day, there will be a restraining order in place. You'll never be able to come near her again. Stephen's fingers curled into fists. Emma barely breathed. Oliver took the final step forward, voice dropping into something quiet, final. You lost the right to call yourself her father a long time ago. Stephen's jaw twitched, fury brewing behind his eyes. But he wasn't stupid. Not enough to fight this battle and lose even more than he already had. His fists unclenched. His sneer returned, but this time it was weaker. Fine, he muttered, stepping back. You think this is over? You've got another thing coming, Stuart. Oliver's eyes didn't waver. Number you do. The moment Stephen turned and walked out the door, Emma collapsed onto the stairs. Not in exhaustion, not in relief, but in shock. Because for the first time in forever, someone had fought for her. And won. The courtroom was suffocating in its silence. The air was thick with tension, the kind that pressed against the walls and settled into the very bones of the room. The dull hum of murmurs had died down as the judge entered, taking his seat at the high bench. Emma sat frozen in her chair, her small hands clasped tightly together in her lap. Andy was too young to be here, left in the care of Oliver's staff, but Emma had insisted on coming. She had to be here. She had to see this through. Across the room, Stephen sat hunched in his chair, his expression caught between indifference and simmering anger. He wore a suit that didn't quite fit, his usual arrogance subdued under the weight of the legal proceedings. But his eyes, dark and full of contempt, still held the same malice Emma had always feared. Oliver sat beside her, his presence solid, unwavering. Unlike Stephen, he looked composed, his suit perfectly pressed, his expression unreadable. But Emma knew better now. She had learned to recognize the controlled intensity in his posture, the subtle way his fingers tapped against the table, a quiet storm held back only by the thin thread of professionalism. The trial began. Oliver's legal team presented their case first. A series of documents were handed over. Police reports detailing Stephen's arrests for public intoxication, domestic disturbances, and gambling debts. There were witness statements from neighbors, old friends of Deborah, and people who had seen the bruises Emma never spoke about. And then came the medical reports. Andy's recent fever, the signs of malnutrition that had been noted by the doctor upon their arrival. Emma flinched at the words. She had always known they had been hungry, but seeing it documented, written in ink, spoken in court, made it feel too real. A lawyer stood, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Stewart, can you explain the circumstances in which you found Miss Burns and her brother?" Oliver leaned forward slightly. His voice was steady and deliberate. "I found them in the middle of a snowstorm. Emma was outside a restaurant, holding her brother, asking for leftover milk. The staff turned them away." His jaw tightened just slightly. She was prepared to spend the night outside in below-freezing temperatures because there was nowhere else to go. A heavy silence followed. Emma felt small, the weight of all those watching eyes pressing into her skin. Then the defense lawyer stood. "Mr. Burns," he said, turning to Stephen, "do you have any response to these accusations?" Stephen scoffed. "They make it sound worse than it is." He adjusted his tie, his smirk creeping back into place. "Look, I had some debts. A few rough years. Who hasn't?" Oliver didn't react. He didn't even look at Stephen, as if the man wasn't worth his attention. Stephen continued, his voice oozing with false sincerity. "She's my daughter, that rich guy." He jerked his chin toward Oliver. "He's trying to take what's mine. I never gave permission for him to have her." Emma's stomach twisted. He didn't want her. He wanted control. The judge cleared his throat. "Miss Burns," he said, and Emma flinched at the sound of her name. "Would you like to speak?" Emma's throat went dry. She glanced at Oliver. He gave her a slow nod, a reassurance. She swallowed hard. Her heart pounded in her ears as she stood. "I don't want to go with him," she said, her voice small but firm. She turned toward the judge, gripping the edge of the table. "He—" Her breath hitched, but she forced herself to continue. "He doesn't care about me, or Andy. He never did." Stephen let out a sharp laugh, leaning back in his chair. "Come on, Em. Don't be dramatic." Emma flinched. Oliver moved. Not much, just a small shift in his posture, the tightening of his jaw, but it was enough. The energy in the room changed. Emma clenched her fists. "I had to run," she said, her voice shaking but growing stronger, "because if I didn't, he was going to sell me to pay off his debts." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Stephen's smirk finally disappeared. The judge's expression hardened. Emma exhaled. For the first time in her life, she had spoken her truth. The final verdict came swiftly. Stephen was found unfit to be a parent. His parental rights were permanently terminated. And more than that, due to the overwhelming evidence of child endangerment and attempted trafficking, he was sentenced to prison. The sound of the gavel hitting wood echoed through the courtroom. It was over. Emma sat frozen in place, the words settling into her bones. Stephen was led out in handcuffs. He didn't look at her, didn't speak, but Emma didn't need him to. She never had to see him again. Her hands trembled slightly. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind exhaustion so deep it felt impossible to move. Then, suddenly, warmth, a hand on her shoulder. She looked up. Oliver. His expression was still composed, still unreadable to most, but she knew better now. He wasn't just calm. He was relieved, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe it. "Let's go home," Oliver said softly. Emma blinked. Not back to the mansion, not back to a temporary shelter. Home. Her home. And for the first time, she let herself feel it. She was safe. The weeks that followed should have been peaceful. Stephen was gone, locked away in a prison cell, stripped of any right to claim her or Andy ever again. The legal battle had ended, the papers had been signed, and the weight that had clung to her shoulders for years should have lifted. And yet, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that none of this was real. Every morning, She woke up expecting it to be different, expecting the warmth of the blankets to be gone, the softness of the bed replaced by concrete and cold air. She waited for the sound of Oliver telling her it was time to leave, waited for the moment when the safety she had been given would be taken back. But it never happened. Instead, Oliver stayed. He didn't press her with questions, didn't force her into conversations she wasn't ready to have. He just continued on with his life as if she and Andy had always been part of it. And that was the hardest part to understand. She had been nothing to people before, a burden, a problem to be dealt with. But Oliver, he had everything. Money, power, a life built on discipline and control. He didn't need 2 children disrupting that. So why was he still here? One evening, after dinner, Oliver sat across from her at the table, his expression unreadable. Andy was playing on the floor with one of the stuffed animals Oliver's staff had given him, babbling softly as he lined up toys in a neat little row. "I want to adopt you." The words landed like a weight in the center of Emma's chest. She stared at him, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her sleeve. "What?" "I want to legally adopt you and Andy," Oliver clarified, his tone as steady as ever. "I've already spoken to my lawyers. It would be simple to finalize, especially after the court ruling." Emma's heart pounded. She should have felt happy, or relieved, or something that wasn't the tight, breathless panic now curling around her ribs. But instead, all she could say was, "Why?" Oliver exhaled, resting his elbows on the table, his hands clasped together as he studied her. "Because you deserve better than wondering when you'll be sent away again." Her throat tightened. "I'm not..." She hesitated. "I'm not yours." "You could be," Oliver said simply. Emma shook her head, staring at the floor. She wanted to believe it, wanted to trust that this wasn't just another situation where someone would change their mind and throw her away when it became inconvenient. But she knew better than that. "I don't need a dad," she muttered. Oliver was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Okay." Emma blinked, confused. "Okay. I'm not asking you to call me anything. I'm not asking you to pretend this is something it's not." He leaned back slightly. "I'm just telling you that I'm not going anywhere." Her fingers curled into fists beneath the table. She didn't understand him, didn't understand why he wanted them when there was nothing he would gain. She had spent her entire life preparing for people to leave. How was she supposed to believe someone would stay? The answer came 3 days later. Andy had woken up in the middle of the night, rubbing at his sleepy eyes, waddling across the hallway in his tiny pajamas. Oliver had been working late in his study again, barely noticing the small figure, until Andy toddled up beside his chair, gripping the armrest. Emma, still half asleep, had come running moments later, only to stop in the doorway. Oliver was staring down at Andy, confused but patient, as the little boy climbed into his lap, curling against his chest like it was the most natural thing in the world. And then, soft, barely audible, spoken between a yawn, "Papa." The breath left Emma's lungs. Oliver stilled completely, his usual sharp, composed demeanor cracking just slightly. Andy snuggled deeper into his chest, sighing contentedly as he drifted back to sleep. And Oliver didn't correct him. He didn't push Andy away. He just sat there, one arm carefully wrapped around the boy, his other hand resting lightly on his back. And in that moment, Emma saw it. The truth she had been trying to ignore. He wasn't pretending to care. He did care. This wasn't about charity. It wasn't about obligation. Oliver had chosen them, and Emma, for the first time in her life, realized she could choose him too. She stepped forward, swallowing the fear that had held her back for so long. "Okay." Oliver glanced up, brow slightly furrowed. "Okay?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Okay," she repeated, her voice softer this time. She didn't say the word. didn't call him anything. But when she sat beside him, resting her head lightly against his arm, he understood. She had chosen. This was home. The adoption papers were signed on a cold morning, the sky a muted shade of grey as the city slowly awakened. The legal process had been surprisingly smooth, expedited by Oliver's lawyers, who had ensured there were no obstacles left in Stephen's absence. There were no grand celebrations, no overwhelming displays of emotion in the courtroom. Just signatures on paper, a judge's final stamp, and the quiet acknowledgement that Emma and Andy were no longer Burns. They were Stewarts now. As they left the courthouse, Emma held onto Andy's small hand tightly, feeling the weight of something she couldn't quite name settling deep inside her chest. She had spent years waiting for the ground beneath her to collapse, waiting to be unwanted, waiting to be abandoned. But now, there was nowhere left to run, because she had a home, because Oliver had chosen her. The first thing she did when they got back was decorate her room. Oliver had given her free rein to choose anything she wanted and had even taken her to a store filled with things she had never imagined picking for herself. A bed that belonged to her. Blankets she could keep. Clothes she didn't have to worry about outgrowing too fast. At first, she had been hesitant, reluctant to believe it was real. But the longer she spent arranging the space, lining up books along the shelves, tacking small pictures onto the walls, the more it sank in. This room wasn't borrowed, it wasn't temporary, it was hers. Andy, of course, had adjusted faster. The little boy had claimed a space of his own, dragging stuffed animals onto the bed Oliver had picked out for him, babbling excitedly in a way that made Emma's chest ache with something warm and unfamiliar. She had spent so long shielding him from the world, making sure he was safe, keeping him fed, keeping him alive. Now, for the first time, he could just be a child, and she could breathe. Oliver changed too. It wasn't something drastic, not at first. His schedule was still meticulous, his calendar still packed with meetings and calls. But where he once spent every waking hour buried in his work, he now found himself pausing. At breakfast, he took his coffee at the table instead of in his office. In the evenings, he came home earlier, no longer letting the weight of his business keep him away for long. And the most surprising part, he didn't seem to mind. Emma noticed it in the small things, the way he always remembered what Andy liked to eat, the way he would casually drop a book onto Emma's nightstand, knowing it was something she would enjoy, the way he never pressed for words, but always listened when she found the courage to speak. For a man who once thrived in a world of deals and negotiations, he had somehow learned the quiet language of family, and that, more than anything, was what made Emma start to believe. One evening, as the sky darkened and the house settled into an easy stillness, Oliver sat on the couch, flipping through the pages of a book. Andy lay curled beside him, half asleep, his tiny fingers gripping the fabric of Oliver's shirt. Emma sat nearby, legs tucked beneath her, her own book resting forgotten in her lap. The fire crackled softly in the fireplace, casting a warm glow over the room. It was a kind of peace she had never known before, the kind that didn't feel like borrowed time. Oliver glanced up from his book, looking between the two of them. He exhaled slowly, as if gathering his thoughts, before speaking. "I wanted to do something meaningful," he said quietly. "For you, for Andy, and for Deborah." Emma looked at him, uncertain. "She was my friend," Oliver continued, his voice steady, but softer than usual. "I didn't get to help her when she needed it, but I can be here for you now." Emma's throat tightened. She didn't know how to respond, didn't know how to put into words the overwhelming weight of everything that had happened. So instead, she did something she had never done before. She leaned into him. Not much, just a slight shift, her shoulder brushing against his arm. But Oliver noticed, and for the first time, she didn't pull away, because the past no longer haunted her, because for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next, because she had a future now. And for Emma Stewart, that was enough. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.